He moved through the darkness long before anyone understood what they were witnessing, long before a name existed, long before fear had a pattern, and in the quiet neighborhoods of California in the early 1970s, something methodical, patient, and disturbingly disciplined was already watching, already learning, already preparing, beginning not with murder, but with intrusion, with silence, with the slow invasion of private spaces that were never meant to be seen by strangers. And in the city of Visalia, a series of burglaries began to unfold, not chaotic, not random, but precise, calculated, almost ritualistic. Windows pried open, homes entered at night, small personal items taken, coins, photographs, objects of no real monetary value, but deep psychological significance, as if the offender was not stealing things but collecting fragments of lives. And investigators would later refer to this figure as the Visalia ransacker, a shadow moving through more than 100 burglaries between 1974 and 1975, a man who studied his victims, who returned to the same neighborhoods, who escalated slowly, deliberately. And during this period, something shifted because burglary alone was no longer enough. The need for control deepened, and in September of 1975, Professor Claude Snelling was shot and killed outside his home after confronting an intruder attempting to abduct his daughter. And although at the time the connection was uncertain, this moment would later be seen as a critical turning point, the first confirmed killing in a trajectory that would grow darker, colder, more violent, and far more terrifying. And soon after, the Visalia crime stopped, but the behavior did not end. It evolved, relocated, and in the Sacramento area, a new wave of fear began to take shape. And this time it was not just homes being entered. It was lives being invaded in ways that left permanent scars, and the name that would emerge was the East Area Rapist, a figure who operated with chilling precision between 1976 and 1979, targeting suburban neighborhoods, selecting victims carefully, often young women, sometimes couples, breaking in during the night, awakening them with a flashlight, whispering threats in a controlled, almost detached voice, binding them with shoelaces, stacking dishes on the backs of male victims with the warning that if anything moved, if anything made a sound, they would be killed, and then proceeding to assault the female victims repeatedly, methodically, sometimes returning to the same homes, sometimes calling victims afterward, breathing into the phone, reinforcing psychological dominance long after the physical act had ended. And what made these attacks even more disturbing was the level of preparation. The offender would scout neighborhoods in advance, learn routines, enter homes when no one was there to unlock windows or remove screens, creating entry points for later. And his movements were athletic, controlled, suggesting someone trained, someone disciplined, someone who understood both fear and how to manipulate it. And law enforcement struggled to keep up. Composite sketches were created, patrols increased, community fear intensified, but the offender adapted, changed tactics, avoided detection, and despite multiple near encounters, despite witnesses, despite physical evidence, he remained unidentified, a ghost operating within predictable unpredictability. And then, as suddenly as the attacks had begun in Northern California, they stopped. But once again, this was not an ending, it was a transformation, because in Southern California, beginning in 1979, a new series of crimes emerged, more violent, more final, and this time the offender would be known as the original Night Stalker. And the pattern escalated from assault to murder, couples targeted in their homes, bound, attacked, and then killed, often with blunt force trauma, sometimes shot, sometimes both, and the brutality intensified, but the methodical nature remained. The same control, the same intrusion, the same terrifying calm. And between 1979 and 1986, at least 10 murders were attributed to this phase, stretching across multiple counties, and investigators began to suspect that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same individual. But the connection was difficult to prove at the time. limited by the forensic capabilities of the era, limited by jurisdictional fragmentation, limited by the sheer complexity of the crimes. And then, just as before, the killings stopped, and for decades, silence followed. A silence that was both relief and torment, because the man responsible had not been caught. He had simply vanished, blending back into society, living an ordinary life while carrying an extraordinary darkness. And during these decades, the case remained open. Investigators revisiting evidence, reanalyzing patterns, comparing notes across jurisdictions, and slowly, with the advancement of forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, a clearer picture began to form, because biological evidence collected from multiple crime scenes confirmed that the same individual was responsible for both the assaults in Northern California and the murders in Southern California, unifying the cases under a single identity, later termed the Golden State Killer, a name that encapsulated the scale and impact of his crimes. And still, the identity behind that name remained unknown, a mystery that persisted for over 40 years, frustrating investigators, haunting victims, and becoming one of the most notorious cold cases in American history, until the emergence of a new investigative technique, one that would redefine the boundaries of forensic science, genetic genealogy. And in 2018, investigators uploaded DNA from the crime scenes to a public genealogy database, searching not for a direct match but for relatives, distant connections, fragments of shared ancestry, and through painstaking analysis, building family trees, narrowing down possibilities, they arrived at a suspect, a former police officer named Joseph James DeAngelo, a man who had lived quietly in Citrus Heights, California, a man who had worked in law enforcement during part of the time the crimes were committed, a detail that would later raise chilling questions about his knowledge of investigative techniques, his ability to evade capture, and his understanding of fear. And surveillance was conducted. DNA was collected from discarded items, and in April of 2018, the results confirmed what had been hidden for decades. The DNA matched, the identity was finally known, and Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested, ending one of the longest and most complex manhunts in modern history. And during the legal proceedings, the scope of his crimes was laid bare. The burglaries, the assaults, the murders, the years of terror inflicted on countless victims. And in 2020, he pleaded guilty to multiple counts, including murder and kidnapping, avoiding the death penalty, but receiving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. And in court, victims and their families spoke, recounting the trauma, the fear, the lasting impact of his actions, while DeAngelo remained largely silent, offering only brief statements, never fully explaining the depth of his motives, never fully revealing the internal mechanisms that drove him to commit such calculated acts of violence over such an extended period of time. And the case, while legally closed, left behind a legacy that continues to shape modern investigations, particularly in the use of genetic genealogy, a tool that has since been applied to solve numerous cold cases, bringing closure to families and accountability to offenders who believe time had erased their crimes. But beyond the technological advancements, the story of the Golden State Killer remains a study in patience, in escalation, in the terrifying possibility that someone can exist within society for decades, undetected, while carrying out acts of unimaginable cruelty. And it forces a confrontation with the limitations of perception, the gaps in systems, the ways in which patterns can remain hidden in plain sight. And as the years pass, the case stands not only as a resolution, but as a warning, a reminder that truth does not disappear, it waits, it endures, it persists through time, through silence, through uncertainty, until the moment when science, persistence, and human determination converge. And in that convergence, even the most carefully hidden identities are brought into the light. And in the end, it was not a confession, not a witness, not a single piece of evidence that solved the case, but a convergence of history, technology, and relentless pursuit, proving that no matter how long it takes, no matter how deeply buried the past may seem, truth remains. Waiting, and DNA, silent yet absolute, becomes the voice that time cannot silence, the final witness that never forgets, and the ultimate force that ensures that even after decades of darkness, the truth will always find its way back into the light. The silence after the arrest did not bring immediate peace. It brought a different kind of weight, a realization that the man who had moved like a shadow through decades of fear had lived among ordinary people, had raised a family, had worked, had aged, while the memories of his crimes remained frozen in time for the victims, unchanged, unresolved, waiting for a name that would only come more than 40 years later. And as investigators began to reconstruct not just the crimes, but the life behind them, the contradictions became impossible to ignore, because Joseph James DeAngelo had once worn a badge, had served as a police officer in Exeter and later in Auburn, had been trained in procedure, in evidence handling, in patrol tactics, and this knowledge would later be seen not as coincidence, but as a critical component in his ability to evade capture, to anticipate investigative steps, to understand response times, to manipulate crime scenes in ways that delayed identification, and when he was fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent, it marked another subtle shift in the timeline, another fracture in a life that outwardly appeared controlled but internally was already spiraling into something far darker, and the timeline of his dismissal aligns with the escalation into the Southern California murders, suggesting not randomness but progression, not chaos but evolution, each phase feeding into the next, each crime refining the method, sharpening the control, deepening the psychological imprint left behind. And investigators would later analyze the patterns not just in terms of location or timing but behavior, the way he spoke, the way he moved, the way he lingered, sometimes staying in homes for hours, eating food, whispering threats, creating an atmosphere where time itself seemed to stretch, where victims were forced into a prolonged state of terror that extended far beyond the physical act. And this psychological dimension became one of the defining characteristics of the case, because the harm inflicted was not limited to the moment. It echoed, it repeated, it returned in phone calls, in memories, in the inability to feel safe even decades later. And when the case entered what would later be known as the Cold Period, it did not fade. It transformed into something else, a persistent absence that investigators refused to accept. Files were reopened, evidence re-examined, new technologies applied, and among those who refused to let the case disappear was Michelle McNamara, a writer who dedicated years to studying the crimes, connecting fragments, advocating for renewed attention, and it was she who popularized the name Golden State Killer, giving a unified identity to a series of crimes that had long been fragmented across jurisdictions and labels. And although she did not live to see the arrest, her work contributed to the momentum that kept the case alive in public consciousness, pushing investigators to continue, to adapt, to explore new methods, and those methods would eventually lead to one of the most significant breakthroughs in forensic history, because the use of genetic genealogy was not simply a new tool, it was a paradigm shift, a way of looking at evidence not as isolated data, but as part of a broader network of human connection. And by uploading DNA profiles to public databases, investigators were able to identify distant relatives, build family trees, eliminate branches, narrow possibilities. And what emerged was not an immediate answer but a direction, a narrowing path that led to a single individual whose age, location, and history aligned with the known patterns. And when surveillance confirmed the match, when discarded DNA was tested and verified, the decades of uncertainty collapsed into a single moment of confirmation. A moment that redefined the case from unsolved mystery to documented reality. And yet, even in that moment, questions remained, not about identity, but about understanding, because knowing who he was did not fully explain why he did what he did. And in court, As victims spoke, as statements were read, as the full weight of the crimes was presented, there was no dramatic revelation, no detailed confession that unpacked the psychology behind the acts. Only brief acknowledgments, fragmented admissions, a controlled presence that echoed the same restraint seen during the crimes themselves. And this absence of explanation became part of the legacy. A reminder that not all truths are fully accessible, that some aspects of human behavior remain resistant to complete understanding, even when the facts are known. And as the case concluded legally, its impact extended far beyond the courtroom, influencing investigative practices across the country, prompting new discussions about privacy, ethics, and the use of public genetic data, raising questions about how far technology should go in the pursuit of justice. And yet for many, the outcome was clear, because for the victims, for the families, for the communities affected, the passage of time had not diminished the need for accountability. It had intensified it, and the arrest demonstrated that time does not erase evidence. It preserves it in ways that are only revealed when the right tools exist to interpret it. And in this sense, the Golden State Killer case became more than a series of crimes. It became a case study in persistence, in evolution, in the intersection between human determination and technological advancement. And as investigators continue to apply these methods to other cold cases, the ripple effect of this investigation continues to grow, solving crimes that once seemed unsolvable, giving names to unknown perpetrators, restoring identities to victims who had long been forgotten, and redefining what it means for a case to remain open. Because in a world where DNA can connect generations, where data can bridge decades, the concept of disappearance changes. It becomes temporary rather than permanent, delayed rather than denied. And in the final analysis, the story of the Golden State Killer is not only about the crimes themselves, but about the long arc of truth, the way it bends through time, through silence, through uncertainty, until it reaches a point where it can no longer be contained. And when it emerges, it does so with a clarity that no amount of planning, no amount of control, no amount of concealment can withstand. Because in the end, every action leaves a trace, every trace carries a story, and every story, no matter how deeply buried, moves toward a moment where it will be heard, understood, and brought into the light, not by chance, not by luck, but by the inevitable convergence of time, memory, and the unyielding precision of DNA, the one witness that never forgets, never changes, and never stops telling the truth. And even after the sentencing, even after the final words echoed through the courtroom, the story did not end, because what remained was not just a closed case, but a landscape of consequences, a map of lives altered permanently, of communities reshaped by fear, of systems forced to confront their own limitations. And in the years following the conviction of Joseph James DeAngelo, investigators and analysts continued to examine the full scope of his actions, not only to document what had happened, but to understand how it had been possible for so long, how a single individual could operate across multiple jurisdictions, across different phases of crime, adapting, evolving, disappearing, and re-emerging without being definitively identified for decades. And one of the most unsettling realizations was not just the sophistication of the offender, but the fragmentation of the response. Because during the 1970s and 1980s, communication between departments was limited, databases were not centralized. Patterns that now seem obvious were then separated by geography, by terminology, by jurisdictional boundaries that prevented a unified view of the crimes. And this fragmentation allowed the offender to exist between systems, to exploit gaps that were not intentional but structural. And as those systems have since evolved, the case has become a reference point, a lesson embedded into training, a reminder that information must flow, that patterns must be shared, that isolation can be as dangerous as ignorance. And alongside these systemic reflections, there remains the human dimension, the voices of those who survived, those who endured not only the initial violence but the long aftermath, the years of uncertainty, the unanswered questions, the constant awareness that the person responsible was still out there, living, moving, existing within the same world. And when the identity was finally revealed, it did not erase what had happened. It did not undo the trauma, but it provided a form of closure that had been delayed for decades, a confirmation that what they experienced was real, that it had a source, that it was not an unsolvable mystery, but a crime committed by a specific individual who could now be named. And in this naming, there is a shift from fear of the unknown to confrontation with the known, from abstraction to reality. And yet, even this shift carries complexity, because the ordinariness of his later life stands in stark contrast to the brutality of his earlier actions, creating a dissonance that challenges assumptions about visibility, about recognition, about the ability to identify danger within familiar environments. And this dissonance continues to influence how investigators think about offender behavior, about the possibility that individuals can compartmentalize, can separate identities, can exist in parallel realities that only intersect through acts of violence. And as forensic science continues to advance, the role of DNA remains central, not only as evidence, but as a narrative thread connecting past to present, linking crime scenes across decades, providing a continuity that human memory alone cannot sustain. And the success of genetic genealogy in this case has led to its application in numerous other investigations, resolving cold cases that had remained unsolved for generations, identifying victims, uncovering offenders, rewriting histories that once seemed fixed in uncertainty. And with each new case solved, the implications deepen, because the boundary between past and present becomes more permeable, more accessible, more subject to reinterpretation through data that was always there, but not always understood. And this raises questions not only about justice, but about time itself, about how long a crime can remain unresolved before it is considered beyond reach. And the answer, increasingly, is that there is no such limit, that as long as evidence exists, as long as DNA can be analyzed, as long as connections can be made, the possibility of resolution remains. And in this context, the Golden State Killer case stands as both a conclusion and a beginning, a point at which one investigation ended and countless others found new direction, new methods, new hope. And as the narrative continues to be studied, documented, and retold, it retains its weight, its intensity, its significance, not because of sensationalism, but because of what it reveals about persistence, about adaptation, about the enduring presence of truth beneath layers of time and silence. And in that final reflection, what remains is not only the record of what happened, but the understanding that no matter how carefully constructed a life may appear, no matter how effectively the past may be hidden, there are traces that cannot be erased, signals that cannot be silenced, patterns that eventually align. And when they do, they form a clarity that transcends years, transcends distance, transcends intention. Because truth does not weaken with time. It accumulates, it gathers strength, it waits for the moment when it can be seen in full. And when that moment arrives, it carries with it the weight of every unanswered question, every unresolved detail, every silent witness, converging into a single undeniable reality. That time may delay justice, but it does not deny it. And DNA, precise and unchanging, becomes the final language through which that justice is spoken, a language that does not forget, does not hesitate, and does not allow the past to remain hidden forever. And beyond the courtroom, beyond the headlines, beyond the finality of sentencing, the case continued to expand outward, influencing not only investigations but the way society understands memory, evidence, and the passage of time. Because what this case revealed with unsettling clarity was that the past is never truly past. It remains embedded in the present, waiting for the moment when it can be decoded, interpreted, and finally understood. And as analysts revisited the timeline, they began to see it not just as a sequence of events, but as a continuum of behavior, a progression that moved from observation to intrusion, from intrusion to domination, from domination to destruction, each phase connected by a consistent need for control, a need that manifested in different forms but never disappeared, only adapted. And this continuity forced a deeper examination of how such patterns develop, how they evolve, how they can remain undetected even when they are repeated, even when they leave behind evidence, even when they intersect with systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of escalation. And part of the answer lies in the complexity of human behavior, in the ability of individuals to mask, to compartmentalize, to exist within structures that do not immediately reveal what lies beneath. And in this case, the fact that Joseph James DeAngelo had a background in law enforcement added another layer, not as a singular explanation, but as a contributing factor, a piece of context that helps illuminate how he understood procedure, how he anticipated response, how he navigated environments that others might find unpredictable. And yet, even with this knowledge, even with this background, the scale and duration of his actions remain difficult to fully comprehend, because they challenge the assumption that such behavior would inevitably lead to detection. And instead, they demonstrate that persistence, combined with adaptation, can extend far beyond expected limits. And as the case has been studied in academic, forensic, and psychological contexts, it has become a reference point for discussions about offender profiling, about investigative coordination, about the importance of data integration, and about the ethical dimensions of emerging technologies, particularly those that involve genetic information. Because while the use of genealogy databases proved instrumental in identifying the suspect, it also raised questions about consent, about privacy, about the boundaries between public data and investigative use. Questions that continue to be debated as similar methods are applied in other cases. And within these debates, there is a tension between the desire for resolution and the need for ethical clarity, a balance that must be navigated carefully as technology continues to evolve. And yet, for many of those directly affected, the outcome of this case represents a form of closure that transcends these broader discussions, a resolution that, while delayed, is nonetheless meaningful, because it replaces uncertainty with knowledge, anonymity with identity, silence with acknowledgement. And in doing so, it allows for a different kind of narrative to emerge, one that is not defined solely by the crimes, but by the response, by the persistence of those who refuse to let the case fade, by the collaboration across disciplines and decades that ultimately brought it to a conclusion. And this narrative continues to influence how future cases are approached, how evidence is preserved, how data is shared, how investigators think about time not as a limiting factor, but as an expanding one, where each passing year can bring new tools, new insights, new possibilities. And in this expanding framework, the concept of a cold case begins to shift. It becomes less about inactivity and more about latency, about waiting for the right moment, the right method, the right connection. And when that moment arrives, the impact can be profound, not only solving a case, but reshaping the methods used to solve others, creating a ripple effect that extends far beyond the original investigation. And as this ripple continues, it carries with it the lessons of what happened, the recognition of what was missed, the understanding of what has changed, and the awareness of what still needs to evolve. And in the final measure, the case stands as a convergence of human endurance and scientific advancement, a point where the limitations of one era were overcome by the innovations of another, where the silence of decades was broken by the precision of molecular evidence, and where the truth, long obscured, emerged not with spectacle but with certainty. And in that certainty lies the enduring impact of the case, a reminder that even the most carefully hidden histories are not beyond reach, that time does not erase but preserves, that memory may fade but evidence remains. and that within the smallest fragments of biological material exists a record that cannot be altered, cannot be denied, and cannot be forgotten, a record that speaks across years, across generations, across silence, carrying with it the undeniable weight of truth, and ensuring that no matter how long it takes, no matter how far the past may seem, it will always find a way to return, to be recognized, to be understood, and to be brought, finally and irrevocably, into the light. And in the years that followed, as the case settled into history yet refused to become distant, it continued to unfold in quieter ways, in studies, in reports, in conversations among investigators who now looked back at the timeline not as an isolated anomaly, but as a blueprint of both failure and evolution. Because embedded within the decades of evasion was a mirror reflecting the limitations of the time, the absence of unified databases, the lack of communication between counties, the reliance on fragmented reports that never fully converged until it was too late. And this realization became one of the most important legacies of the case, not the crimes themselves, but what they exposed about the systems meant to prevent them, and how those systems would need to change moving forward, and in training rooms, in forensic labs, in academic institutions. The case of Joseph James DeAngelo began to be studied not only as a criminal investigation, but as a turning point, a moment, where the past collided with the future, where traditional methods reached their limits and new approaches emerged to take their place. And among those approaches, genetic genealogy stood at the center, not as a replacement for investigative work, but as an extension of it, a tool that required patience, interpretation, and careful validation. And its success in this case reshaped expectations, because it demonstrated that even when direct evidence fails to identify a suspect, indirect connections can still lead to the truth, that family trees, distant relatives, shared markers can form a pathway through time, narrowing uncertainty into certainty. And this pathway has since been followed in numerous cases, each one reinforcing the principle that identity can no longer remain hidden indefinitely, that anonymity is no longer guaranteed by time alone. And yet within this advancement, there remains a quiet tension, a recognition that every new capability carries with it new responsibilities, new ethical considerations, new questions about how far the pursuit of justice should extend into the personal data of individuals who may have no direct connection to the crimes being investigated. And these questions do not diminish the importance of the outcomes, but they add layers to the conversation, ensuring that progress is accompanied by reflection, that innovation is balanced with accountability. And as these discussions continue, the case itself remains anchored in its human impact, in the voices that spoke during sentencing, in the stories that were finally heard after decades of silence, in the acknowledgement of harm that had long gone unanswered. And for those who lived through the events, the passage of time did not dilute the memory. It preserved it, held it in place until the moment when it could be addressed. And when that moment arrived, it brought with it not only relief, but a complex mixture of emotions, because closure does not erase the past. It reframes it. It allows it to be understood within a complete narrative rather than an unresolved question. And in that reframing, there is a shift from uncertainty to definition, from fear of the unknown to recognition of the known. And this shift, while not healing in itself, creates the conditions for healing to begin. And as the narrative continues to be examined, retold, and integrated into the broader understanding of criminal investigation, it carries with it a clarity that was once absent, a clarity that emerged not from a single breakthrough, but from the accumulation of effort, the persistence of individuals who refused to accept silence as an answer, who continued to search, to question, to revisit evidence long after others had moved on. And it is within this persistence that the deeper meaning of the case can be found, not only in the resolution of a single investigation, but in the demonstration that time, when combined with determination and evolving knowledge, becomes an ally rather than an obstacle, a force that can bring hidden truths into focus rather than allowing them to fade. And in this sense, the case stands as a testament to continuity, to the idea that every action leaves a trace, every trace holds information, and every piece of information has the potential to connect with something else, forming a network that grows more complete with each passing year. And as this network expands, it reduces the space in which secrets can exist. It narrows the gaps through which individuals can disappear. And it reinforces the principle that truth is not static, it is dynamic. It moves, it adapts, it waits for the moment when it can be fully realized. And when that moment arrives, it carries with it the weight of everything that came before, every unanswered question, every unresolved detail, every silent witness, converging into a single, undeniable reality that no matter how carefully the past is concealed, no matter how effectively time seems to obscure it, there is a point at which concealment fails, at which obscurity dissolves, and at which the underlying structure of truth becomes visible in its entirety. And in that visibility lies the final impact of the case, a reminder that justice is not bound by immediacy, that resolution is not limited by years, and that within the smallest strands of DNA exists a permanence that transcends time itself, a permanence that ensures that even in the longest silence, even in the deepest darkness, the truth remains intact, waiting, enduring, and ultimately returning with a precision that cannot be denied, a voice that cannot be silenced, and a certainty that affirms, beyond doubt, that time may delay the revelation, but it will never erase the truth, because DNA remembers everything. And as the narrative stretches even further beyond the moment of conviction, it begins to merge with something larger than a single investigation, something that exists at the intersection of memory, science, and the quiet persistence of truth. Because what this case ultimately revealed is not only how one man operated in the shadows for decades, but how those shadows themselves have limits. How even the most carefully constructed absence can be interrupted by a presence that cannot be erased. And within this understanding, the story continues, not in new crimes, not in new discoveries, but in the way it reshapes perception, in the way it alters how investigators approach the unknown, how they interpret silence, how they recognize that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And this shift is subtle but profound, because it transforms uncertainty from a barrier into a space of possibility, a space where new methods can be applied, where old evidence can be re-examined, where connections that once seemed invisible can be brought into focus. And in this evolving framework, the case of Joseph James DeAngelo becomes more than a historical record. It becomes a reference point for what can be achieved when time, technology, and determination converge. And this convergence is not accidental. It is the result of continuous effort, of investigators who refused to accept that decades of silence meant the end of the story, of analysts who looked at fragmented data and saw not confusion but potential alignment, of scientists who developed tools capable of reading information stored at the most fundamental level of human biology. And through these combined efforts, the narrative was reconstructed piece by piece until it reached a level of clarity that could no longer be denied. And yet, even within this clarity, there remains an element that cannot be fully resolved, a dimension that exists beyond data, beyond timelines, beyond evidence, and that is the question of human capacity, the ability of an individual to move between ordinary life and extraordinary violence without immediate detection, to maintain appearances while concealing actions that stand in complete opposition to those appearances. And this duality challenges not only investigative methods, but broader assumptions about identity, about behavior, about the visible and the hidden aspects of human existence. And as this challenge continues to be explored, the case serves as both a warning and a guide. A warning that such dualities can exist, and a guide that demonstrates how they can eventually be uncovered. not through a single moment of revelation, but through a sustained process of inquiry, adaptation, and verification. And in this process, the role of DNA emerges not only as a tool, but as a constant, a fixed point within a shifting landscape, something that does not change even as everything around it does, something that carries within it a record that is immune to time, to memory, to intention. And this constancy is what ultimately allowed the case to be solved, what allowed decades of uncertainty to collapse into a single, undeniable conclusion. And as the implications of this continue to unfold, they extend into areas far beyond this specific investigation, influencing how future cases are approached, how evidence is preserved, how data is shared, how technology is integrated into the pursuit of justice. And within all of these developments, there remains a central truth, one that resonates beyond the specifics of any single case. And that is the understanding that time is not an eraser. It is a container. It holds information. It preserves traces. It allows for accumulation rather than disappearance. And when the tools exist to access what has been preserved, the past becomes present again, not as memory, but as evidence, not as speculation, but as fact. And in this transformation lies the enduring impact of the case, a demonstration that truth is not dependent on immediacy, that it does not require recognition in the moment to remain valid, that it can exist quietly, persistently, until the conditions are right for it to be revealed. And when that revelation occurs, it carries with it the full weight of everything that preceded it, every action, every detail, every fragment, converging into a clarity that transcends the passage of time. And in that clarity, there is no ambiguity, no uncertainty, only the definitive presence of what is real, what is proven, what is undeniable. And as the story reaches its final reflection, it does so not with closure in the traditional sense, but with a continuation of understanding, a recognition that while the individual responsible has been identified, the lessons of the case continue to evolve, to inform, to guide, and to shape the future of investigation. And in this ongoing influence, the narrative remains alive, not as a story of fear, but as a testament to persistence, to the capacity of truth to endure, and to the role of DNA as the ultimate witness, silent yet absolute, unaffected by time, unaltered by memory, and unwavering in its ability to reveal what has been hidden, ensuring that no matter how long the silence lasts, no matter how deeply the past is buried, the truth remains intact, waiting, and inevitable. Because in the end, time does not protect what is false, it protects what is real. And when the moment arrives, when the convergence is complete, when the evidence is understood, the truth does not emerge gradually. It arrives all at once, precise, unchallenged, and final, carried on the unchanging code within DNA, the one record that never forgets, never forgives, and never allows the past to remain hidden forever. And even as the final echoes of the case settle into history, there remains a lingering stillness, not empty, not silent, but filled with the weight of everything that has been uncovered, everything that has been understood, and everything that can never again be unseen. Because the story of Joseph James DeAngelo does not conclude in a single moment of resolution. It disperses. It integrates into the broader fabric of how truth is pursued, how time is interpreted, how evidence is valued. And in that integration, it becomes something enduring, something that continues to shape perception long after the immediate events have passed. And in quiet rooms where investigators review old files, in laboratories where samples are processed with increasing precision, in conversations where methods are debated and refined, the influence of this case persists, not as a distant reference, but as an active presence, a reminder that no detail is too small, no connection too distant, no piece of evidence too insignificant to matter. And this awareness changes the way cases are approached. It introduces a level of patience that extends beyond conventional timelines, a recognition that what cannot be solved today may become solvable tomorrow, not because the facts change, but because the tools used to interpret those facts evolve. And within this evolution lies a fundamental shift, a movement away from the idea that time diminishes the possibility of resolution toward an understanding that time can enhance it, that each passing year adds context, adds capability, adds perspective, and in this accumulation, the conditions for discovery become stronger rather than weaker. And as this perspective takes hold, it transforms not only investigative strategy, but the emotional landscape surrounding unsolved cases, replacing resignation with persistence, replacing uncertainty with potential. And in this transformation, the story extends beyond its original boundaries, becoming part of a larger narrative about how truth operates across time, how it resists disappearance, how it remains embedded within the smallest fragments of reality, waiting for the moment when it can be recognized. And that moment, when it arrives, is not defined by spectacle. It is defined by clarity, by the sudden alignment of information that reveals what has always been there, hidden not by absence, but by limitation. And when those limitations are removed, when knowledge advances to the point where it can access what was previously inaccessible, the result is not creation but revelation, the unveiling of something that existed all along. And this is perhaps the most profound aspect of the case, not that it was solved, but that it demonstrates how solutions can exist long before they are realized, how truth can remain intact even when it is not yet understood, and how the passage of time, rather than erasing that truth, preserves it in a form that can be accessed when the necessary conditions are met. And as this understanding deepens, it reinforces a principle that extends far beyond any single investigation, a principle that speaks to the nature of reality itself, that what is real does not vanish, it persists, it endures, it waits. And when the moment comes, when the convergence of time, effort, and knowledge reaches its peak, that persistence becomes visible, undeniable, and absolute. And in that visibility lies the final resonance of the story, a resonance that continues to echo through every case that follows, through every investigation that refuses to close without answers, through every effort to bring clarity to what once seemed permanently obscured. And in this echo, there is a certainty that cannot be diminished, a recognition that while time may obscure, it does not destroy, that while memory may fade, evidence remains, and that within that evidence exists a record that cannot be altered, cannot be silenced, and cannot be forgotten, a record carried within DNA, precise, immutable, and eternal in its function, ensuring that no matter how long the silence lasts, no matter how deeply the past is buried, the truth remains intact, waiting, and inevitable, because in the end, time does not protect secrets, it reveals them, and DNA is the mechanism through which that revelation becomes complete, the final witness that speaks when all others have fallen silent, the final proof that truth, once created, can never truly disappear, only wait for the moment when it is finally and irrevocably brought into the light. And when the story reaches the point where no further facts can be added, where the timeline has been fully reconstructed, where every known detail has been placed into its position, what remains is not emptiness, but a deeper layer of meaning, something that exists beneath the sequence of events, beneath the documented evidence, beneath the confirmed identity, a realization that extends beyond the case itself and into the nature of truth, of time, of consequence, because the investigation did not only uncover a man, it uncovered a pattern of existence that challenges the way reality is perceived, the way safety is assumed, the way normalcy is defined. And in confronting this pattern, there is an unavoidable recognition that the surface of life, the visible, the familiar, can conceal depths that remain undetected for years, even decades. And this concealment is not infinite, it is temporary. Because every action leaves an imprint, every decision creates a trace, And those traces, no matter how small, no matter how dispersed, accumulate. They persist. They remain embedded within the fabric of reality, waiting for the moment when they can be connected, interpreted, and understood. And in the case of Joseph James DeAngelo, those traces were not erased by time. They were preserved by it, held within evidence that outlasted memory, outlasted fear, outlasted uncertainty, until the tools existed to read what had always been there. And when that moment arrived, it did not create truth. It revealed it. It brought into focus something that had never ceased to exist, only remained unseen. And this distinction is essential because it shifts the understanding of justice from something that is produced to something that is uncovered, something that is already present, already embedded within the past, waiting to be accessed. And as this understanding settles, it carries with it a sense of inevitability, not in the actions that were committed, but in the eventual emergence of their consequences. Because concealment is not permanence, it is delay, and delay, no matter how long, does not alter the underlying reality. It only postpones its recognition. And in this postponement, there is a tension, a space where uncertainty exists, where questions remain unanswered, where silence dominates. But even within that silence, the truth continues to exist, unchanged, unaffected, intact. And when the conditions align, when knowledge advances, when persistence continues, that truth moves from hidden to visible, from unknown to known, from silence to clarity. And in that transition, there is no ambiguity, no distortion, only the direct presence of what is real. And this is the final dimension of the story, not the crimes, not the investigation, not even the resolution, but the principle that emerges from all of it, the understanding that truth is not subject to time, that it does not weaken, does not fade, does not disappear. It remains constant, precise, embedded within the smallest elements of existence. And among those elements, DNA stands as the most definitive, the most unchanging, the most absolute, a record that does not rely on memory, does not depend on testimony, does not require interpretation beyond its own structure. And because of this, it becomes the ultimate witness, one that cannot be influenced, cannot be altered, cannot be silenced. And as long as it exists, the truth exists with it, inseparable, enduring, and inevitable. And in the end, when all narratives have been told, when all details have been examined, when all voices have spoken, what remains is this single, undeniable certainty that time may delay justice. It may obscure it, it may challenge it, but it cannot prevent it, because within the unbroken code of DNA lies a permanence that transcends every attempt at concealment, a permanence that ensures that no matter how deeply the past is buried, no matter how long the silence endures, the truth will remain, waiting, intact. And when it emerges, it does so with a clarity that cannot be questioned, a final revelation that affirms, beyond doubt, that nothing real is ever truly lost. It is only waiting to be found. And in that final stillness, when every known detail has been spoken, when every movement has been traced back through time, when every shadow has been given a form and a name, there is a moment where the story stops being about a man and becomes something else entirely, something colder, something more permanent. Because what this case ultimately leaves behind is not just memory, not just documentation, but a structure of truth that exists independently of those who tell it, independently of those who lived it, a structure that does not change, does not adapt, does not fade. And in that structure, every action remains fixed, every consequence remains attached, every moment remains preserved exactly as it happened, untouched by time, untouched by interpretation, untouched by denial. And this is where the illusion ends, the illusion that time can protect, the illusion that silence can erase, the illusion that distance can dissolve what has already been done, because none of those forces alter reality. They only delay its recognition. They only create a space where truth exists without being seen, without being acknowledged, without being confronted, and yet even in that space, it remains complete, it remains intact, it remains exactly what it was from the moment it occurred. And in the case of Joseph James DeAngelo, that reality did not weaken over the decades. It did not fragment. It did not disappear. It waited, preserved within evidence that carried no emotion, no fear, no passage of time, only information, only fact, only the silent record of what had taken place. And when that record was finally understood, when science reached the point where it could read what had always been written, the past did not return as memory. It returned as certainty, absolute, unchangeable, undeniable. And in that certainty, there is no space left for doubt, no space left for reinterpretation. Only the direct confrontation with what is real. And this confrontation is not dramatic, it is not emotional, it is precise, it is final. It is the moment where all possibilities collapse into a single truth that cannot be avoided, cannot be escaped, cannot be undone. And beyond that moment, there is nothing left to uncover, nothing left to reveal. Only the understanding that what has been established will remain established, permanently, irreversibly. And as the story settles into that permanence, it leaves behind something that extends beyond the case itself. A principle that applies universally, that no matter how carefully something is hidden, no matter how long it remains undiscovered, no matter how completely it seems to vanish from the surface of the world, it does not cease to exist. It does not lose its form. It does not become something else. It remains exactly what it is, waiting for the moment when it will be recognized. And that moment, when it arrives, is not influenced by time. It is defined by it, because time does not erase truth. It preserves it. It carries it forward. It holds it in place until the conditions exist for it to be seen. And when those conditions are met, the revelation is not partial. It is complete. It is immediate. It is absolute. And in that absoluteness lies the final impact of everything that has happened. The understanding that truth is not something that can be created or destroyed. It is something that exists continuously, independently, and inevitably, and among all the ways in which it can exist. DNA remains the most precise, the most reliable, the most permanent, a record that cannot forget because it does not remember. It simply is, and because it is, it carries within it everything that has ever been encoded into it, unchanged, unbroken, waiting. And in that waiting, there is no uncertainty, only inevitability, the certainty that at some point, in some moment, under the right conditions, it will be read, it will be understood, it will be revealed. And when that happens, the silence ends, not gradually, not partially, but completely, replaced by a clarity that leaves nothing hidden, nothing unresolved, nothing uncertain. And that clarity is the final state of the story, the point where time, truth, and evidence converge into a single, unalterable reality, one that cannot be undone, cannot be rewritten, cannot be escaped. And in that reality, there is only one conclusion that remains steady, cold, and absolute. That time may delay the moment, but it does not change the outcome. And DNA, silent and exact, will always be there, waiting to speak, waiting to reveal, waiting to prove that the truth was never gone, only waiting to be found.